France, one thought that they were called dumb, retarded, a word that was used, unfortunately, at that time. And then one tried to see why not. Now, that analysis has been really rejected greatly over the past years, because industrial revolution is measured by more than simply large factories with industrial workers and the number of machines. This is the point of the beginning of this. The more that we look at the Industrial Revolution, the more that we see that the Industrial Revolution was first and foremost an intensification of forms of production, of kinds of production that were already there. And thus, we spend more time looking at, the intensification of artisanal production, craft production, of domestic industry, which we've already mentioned, that is people mostly women but also men and children, too, working in the countryside. The rapid rise of industrial production was very much tied to traditional forms of production. In Paris, for example, in 1871, 1870, the average unit of production had only slightly more than 7 people in it. So, if you only look for big factories and lots of machines, you'll be missing the boat on the Industrial Revolution. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the idea of the Industrial Revolution was that it was the work of some genius inventors who created machines used primarily in the textile industry but also in mining that eliminated blocks to assembly line production. Then, everybody was crowded into factories and the new brave world opened up. In fact, one of the most interesting books and great classics that is still in print was written by an economic historian at Harvard who is still alive called David Landis. It's a good book called The Unbound Prometheus, which was basically that. Some of the inventions that I briefly describe in your reading, the spinning jenny, etc., refer to that. Well, and that kind of analysis led one to concentrate on England where the Industrial Revolution began, and to view industrialization as beginning a situation of winners and losers by not going as fast. Now, that analysis has been really rejected greatly over the past years, because industrial revolution is measured by more than simply large factories with industrial workers and the number of machines. This is the point of the beginning of this. The more that we look at the Industrial Revolution, the more that we see that the Industrial Revolution was first and foremost an intensification of forms of production, of kinds of production that were already there. And, thus, we spend more time looking at the intensification of artisanal production, craft production, of domestic industry, which we've already mentioned, that is people mostly women but also men and children, too, working in the countryside. The rapid rise of industrial production was very much tied to traditional forms of production. Why should we read the Republic? I met lots of students ask this question to themselves when they're given it as a set of books at the beginning of their university course. But in fact, there are many good reasons to read the Republic. And the first one I would pick on is just that it is immensely readable. It's not Plato did not write philosophy like a dry textbook. He wrote it like a living conversation. The whole of the Republic, which is a fairly fat book, is a living conversation written in short, almost soundbite type answers, but nevertheless, developing some very, very important ideas. So, my first answer then, we should read the Republic just because it is readable. It is readable, it was written by a genius, and it's worth reading. It's easy to read. It's not difficult. But then there's also obviously the thoughts, the content of the book, and he's asking this absolutely fundamental question: why should we bother to be good? What's in it for us effectively? It seems when we look at the world, it looks as though injustice pays. It looks as though crime pays, whereas the good people get trodden down. So, Plato addresses this absolutely fundamental question: why should we be good? I'm not going to tell you his answer. Read the book. There are many good reasons for people to read the Republic. "23,000 years ago, towards the end of the Old Stone Age, also known as the Upper Paleolithic, the weather in Europe and in many parts of the world took a turn for the worse. Temperatures plummeted, rain levels fell, and a massive ice sheet slowly advanced to cover most of northern Europe and stay there for the next few thousand years. We know that, during this glacial period, many animal and plant species sought shelter in Europe's three warmer southern peninsulas, Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans. But the question is, where did the people go? Archaeological material recovered from this time period has shown that a large number of our ancestors retreated to Franco-Cantabria, an area covering the southwest of France and the northeastern tip of Spain. But was this the only area where people traveled to escape the worst of the weather? Let's go back to the growing ice sheet. In order to grow, the ice mass had to take up water, causing sea levels to fall. At its maximum, when the ice reached as far south as Germany, sea levels were up to 120 meters lower than today. That's approximately the same height as the London Eye. As a result, areas of the shallow sea became exposed and Europe's shape was very different from the one we recognized. It could be that humans lived on these exposed shores during the Paleolithic, but we have no evidence of their settlements because it's now all underwater. And then in the 1950s, philosophers had this novel idea that perhaps the mind is just identical with the brain. Okay. And this hadn't occurred to philosophers before, and so it happened around the same time the first department of neuroscience started forming, like MIT and Stanford, so forth. But basically, there are a couple of philosophers, both educated here in Oxford Place, 1956, and smart, 1959, and they made the claim that the mind just is the brain. So that is the identity theory, and with identity and logic is the strongest relation. When you have identity between A and B, you don't have two things, you have one thing. Alright? So now when you talk about mental events, you are talking about brain events. Maybe when you talk about brain events, you are talking about mental events. Okay. So that's the identity theory. And it's very popular. It's basically the idea that mental properties are just properties of the brain.